The summer of 1847 arrived in Louisiana like a fever, thick, suffocating, and impossible to escape. The air hung heavy with the scent of magnolias and decay, a sweetness that masked the rot beneath. In the parish of St. Helena, where cotton fields stretched endlessly toward horizons that offered no freedom, the Beaumont estate rose like a monument to power itself. Governor Charles Beaumont owned everything the eye could see: 20,000 acres, 300 souls in bondage, and a wife whose beauty was discussed in parlors from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. Eleanor Beaumont was a vision rendered in silk and pearls. Her blonde hair always perfectly arranged, her posture a study in aristocratic grace. At 32, she had mastered the art of being admired without being known, loved without being touched, envied without being understood. But beneath the corsets and courtesy, beneath the practiced smiles and Sunday prayers, Eleanor Beaumont was suffocating. The mansion itself was a cathedral of southern excess. White columns that reached toward God, marble floors imported from Italy, chandeliers that caught the light like frozen waterfalls, 12 bedrooms, though only one was occupied by husband and wife, separate wings, separate lives, separate worlds under the same roof. Charles Beaumont was 57, a man whose face had been carved by ambition and hardened by power. His political career had been built on cotton, compromise, and the calculated subjugation of those he deemed inferior. He spoke of civilization and progress, while his wealth dripped with the blood of those who picked his fields under the Louisiana sun. He loved his wife the way he loved his plantation, as property, as reflection, as proof of his dominion over the world. Eleanor knew her place in this arrangement. She had known it since the day her father sold her future for political favor when she was 17. Marriage was not romance, but transaction, not partnership, but performance. She played her role with precision, the gracious hostess, the devoted wife, the symbol of refinement that every governor needed on his arm, until the day she saw Elijah. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. It happened in the stables on a morning in late May when the heat had not yet become unbearable and the world still pretended at gentleness. Eleanor had come to inspect the new mare Charles had purchased. Another acquisition, another display of wealth. She rarely ventured to the working parts of the estate. Her world was confined to gardens, parlors, and the suffocating propriety of afternoon teas. But that morning, drawn by restlessness she could not name, she walked past the rose garden, past the quarters where the house servants lived, toward the stables where the field workers occasionally came for repairs and supplies. He was shoeing a horse when she entered. Elijah was 30 years old, though the record books listed him as property item number 47, acquired in 1839 for $800. He stood 6 feet tall, his body sculpted by labor that would have broken lesser men, his skin dark as the Louisiana earth after rain. But it was his eyes that stopped Eleanor in her tracks, eyes that did not lower, did not submit, did not perform the degradation that slavery demanded. He looked at her for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity. Then he returned to his work. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, something she had sealed away so thoroughly she had forgotten it existed. She stood there, frozen, watching the way his hands moved with precision and care, the way sweat traced paths down his forearms, the way he spoke softly to the horse in a voice that carried no fear, no anger, only a quiet strength that seemed impossible in a world designed to destroy it. "You," she said, her voice barely audible. "What is your name?" He did not look up. "Elijah, ma'am." "Elijah," she repeated, and the name felt like prayer and blasphemy all at once. She left without another word, her heart thundering against her ribs, her hands trembling inside her lace gloves. That night she could not eat. She could not sleep. She lay beside her husband's snoring form and stared at the ceiling, seeing nothing but those eyes. Eyes that refused to be owned, refused to be nothing, refused to disappear. It should have ended there. In any rational world, in any story with sense and safety, Eleanor Beaumont would have returned to her needlepoint and her social calls, and Elijah would have remained what the law declared him to be. A thing, not a person. Certainly not a man who could matter. But the heart does not obey the law, and some hungers, once awakened, cannot be starved back into silence. The second time they spoke was in the rose garden 3 days later. Eleanor had taken to walking there in the early morning, before the house stirred, before the performance of her life began. She told herself she needed air, needed solitude, needed anything but the truth that was clawing its way to the surface. Elijah was pruning the roses. His presence there was not unusual. The enslaved people of the Beaumont estate were everywhere and nowhere, visible only when needed, invisible when inconvenient. But Eleanor knew, in the way that guilt and desire always know, that he had been assigned to this task deliberately, that someone, perhaps the overseer, perhaps fate itself, had placed them in proximity again. "They're beautiful," she said, gesturing toward the roses. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was careful, neutral, empty of anything that could be used against him. "Do you have a family, Elijah?" The question hung in the humid air like something dangerous. Enslaved people were not supposed to have families, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that was protected by law or sentiment. They had connections that could be severed at auction, bonds that existed only until they became inconvenient to the master's profit. "Had a wife once," he said quietly, his hands never stopping their work. "Sold off 7 years back. Alabama, I heard. Had a daughter too. Never knew what happened to her." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had heard such stories before. Everyone had. They were the background noise of Southern life, the acceptable tragedies that allowed people like her to sleep in silk sheets while others slept in chains. But hearing it from his lips, seeing the grief that lived in the set of his shoulders, made it real in a way that shattered something fundamental inside her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not hope, which would have been foolish, not trust, which would have been impossible, but recognition, perhaps, the acknowledgement that she had spoken to him as if he were human, as if his loss mattered, as if his pain was not just the natural order of things. "Sorrow don't change nothing, ma'am," he said, "but I thank you for it anyway." She wanted to say more. She wanted to rage against the injustice, to promise things she had no power to deliver, to somehow erase the chasm of cruelty that stood between them. But the words died in her throat, because what could she say that would not be obscene in its inadequacy? Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. At first they barely spoke. Eleanor would walk among the roses while Elijah tended them, the silence between them heavy with things that could not be said. But gradually, carefully, words began to emerge, small exchanges that meant nothing and everything. She asked about the roses, and he taught her their names, their needs, the patience required to make beauty bloom in hostile soil. He spoke of seasons and pruning, of knowing when to cut back and when to let grow, and she heard in his words a metaphor for survival that made her chest ache. She told him about books she had read, about the world beyond Louisiana that she would never see, about the suffocating emptiness of a life lived entirely for appearance. She did not tell him she was lonely. That would have been too naked, too honest. But he heard it anyway, in the pauses between her words, in the way her voice softened when she forgot to perform. The house servants noticed first. They always did. Enslaved people survived by paying attention, by reading the subtleties that white folks thought were invisible. They saw Eleanor Beaumont rising before dawn, saw her walking to the rose garden with increasing frequency, saw the way she lingered when Elijah was there and left quickly when he was not. Mama Seraphine, the cook who had served the Beaumont family for 34 years, watched with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She said nothing, but she began leaving biscuits wrapped in cloth near the garden gate. A small kindness, a silent warning, a prayer against the storm she knew was coming, because everyone knew what happened when white women looked at black men with anything other than indifference or contempt. Everyone knew the stories of accusations and lynchings, of bodies found swinging from trees, of communities destroyed because someone smiled too warmly or stood too close. But Eleanor and Elijah were not smiling. They were drowning, separately and together, in something neither of them had permission to feel. By the end of June, they were talking about things that mattered. She told him about her marriage, not in complaint, which would have been unseemly, but in careful confession. The loneliness, the sense of being a decoration rather than a person, the slow suffocation of living a life chosen by others. He told her about freedom, not as a place, but as a feeling he remembered from childhood before he had been sold for the first time at age 8. The memory of his mother's voice, the taste of food he had grown himself, the brief, shining moments when he had belonged to himself. They never touched, not once. They maintained the physical distance that law and custom demanded, but in every other way they were reaching toward each other across an abyss that was supposed to be uncrossable. And in the mansion, Governor Charles Beaumont began to notice that his wife was smiling again. He did not know why, and that made him uneasy. A man of his position understood power, control, the careful maintenance of order. A happy wife was desirable, but a wife with secrets was dangerous. He began to watch. And in the slave quarters, people began to pray. July arrived with a vengeance that seemed almost biblical. The sun pressed down on Louisiana like God's own judgment, turning the air into something visible, something that had to be pushed through with effort. The cotton fields shimmered with heat waves, and the enslaved workers moved through them like ghosts, their bodies mechanical with exhaustion, their minds fled to whatever interior spaces still belonged to them alone. Inside the Beaumont mansion, Eleanor felt the heat in a different way, as fever, as madness, as the physical manifestation of what was growing inside her chest. She had stopped pretending, at least to herself, that her morning walks were about roses or fresh air or any of the acceptable reasons a woman of her station might leave her bed before dawn. She went to see him. That was the truth. Simple, terrible, undeniable. Elijah had been reassigned to work closer to the main house. The overseer, a man named Thaddeus Cole, whose cruelty was legendary even by the standards of an institution built on cruelty, had made the change without explanation. Some of the other enslaved people whispered that Cole suspected something, that he was positioning Elijah where he could be watched more carefully. Others thought it was coincidence, the random reshuffling of human property that happened constantly on plantations. But Mama Seraphine knew better. She had seen the way Governor Beaumont's eyes had begun to track his wife's movements, had heard him asking casual questions about Eleanor's habits, her routines, her unexplained cheerfulness. The governor was not a fool. He was a predator, patient and calculating, and he had caught the scent of something wrong. "Child," Seraphine said to Eleanor one morning, catching her in the hallway before she could slip outside. "You playing with fire that gonna burn more than just you?" Eleanor stopped, her hand on the doorframe. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." The old woman's voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of someone who had watched this story before, who knew how it ended. "I seen the way you look when you come back from the morning walks. I seen the way that man look when you pass by, and I'm telling you now, ain't nothing good gonna come from this." "We've done nothing wrong," Eleanor said, and heard the desperation in her own voice. "Don't matter what you done or ain't done. Matters what it look like. Matters what the governor gonna think when he find out. And he will find out, Miss Eleanor. He always do." Eleanor met the old woman's eyes and saw genuine fear there, not for Eleanor's reputation or marriage, but for Elijah's life. That was what transgression meant in this world. For her, it might mean scandal, divorce, social exile. For him, it meant rope and fire, and a death so brutal it would be used as a warning for generations. "I'll be careful," Eleanor whispered. "Careful ain't enough," Seraphine replied. "You need to stop, now, before it's too late." But it was already too late, and both women knew it. That afternoon, Eleanor found Elijah in the workshed behind the stables, repairing a broken wagon wheel. The space was dim and close, smelling of wood shavings and oil, and for the first time since their encounters began, they were truly alone. No garden paths where servants might pass, no open spaces visible from the house. "You shouldn't be here," Elijah said without looking up, his hands steady on the spoke he was fitting into place. "I know. They watching now. Cole been asking questions. Where I go, what I do, who I talk to." "I know," Eleanor repeated, and this time her voice broke slightly. Elijah set down his tools and finally looked at her. In the shadowed interior of the workshed, his face was half hidden, but his eyes caught what little light filtered through the cracks in the walls. "Then why you here?" She could not answer. How could she explain that she had spent 15 years of marriage feeling like a china doll in a glass case, beautiful and brittle and utterly lifeless, until 3 months ago when a man who was not supposed to be a man had looked at her like she was real? How could she articulate that for the first time in her adult life she felt seen, heard, known, not as an ornament or a duty, but as a person with thoughts and desires and a soul that was starving? "Because I can't stay away," she said. Finally, and the honesty of it hung between them like something sacred and profane all at once. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and careful. "You know what they do to men like me who even get accused of looking wrong at women like you? Don't matter if it's true or not. Don't matter if she the one who come to him. They tie him to a tree and they—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes." "Then you understand I can't want this. Can't let myself want this. Wanting things ain't for people like me. It's just a way to die faster." Eleanor took a step closer, then another. She was trembling from fear or desire or the collision of both, she could not tell. "What if I want it enough for both of us? That ain't how the world work, Miss Eleanor. My name is Eleanor, just Eleanor. When we're alone, please, don't call me Miss anything. Let me be just a woman, just once, just here." Did something shifted in his expression then, a crack in the armor of survival that enslaved people wore like a second skin. "You asking me to forget everything that keep me alive, everything I learned since I was old enough to understand that my life don't belong to me. I'm asking you to remember that you're human, that I'm human, that this," she gestured between them, "this feeling, whatever it is, it's real, it matters. Even if the world says it doesn't, even if the world says we don't." Elijah looked at her for a long time, and she saw the war playing out across his face, between self-preservation and the desperate human need to be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone in a world that had spent his entire life telling him he was nothing. Finally, he spoke. "My daughter's name was Grace. I think about her every day. Wonder if she remember me. Wonder if she alive. Wonder if she, growing up thinking her daddy just left her, didn't fight for her, didn't love her enough to—" His voice caught. "I couldn't save her, couldn't save my wife, couldn't save myself. I wake up every morning in chains I can't see, but I feel in every breath I take. And you standing here asking me to feel something, to want something, to be something other than what they made me. You know how much that hurt?" Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry. I should never have—" "I didn't say stop." The words fell between them like a match into kindling. "I didn't say I don't feel it. Elijah continued, his voice rough with emotion he had spent a lifetime suppressing. I didn't say I don't see you every time I close my eyes, don't hear your voice when I'm trying to sleep, don't wake up thinking about the way you really listen when I talk, like my words got value. I just said it hurt. But maybe... He paused, something desperate and reckless flickering across his face. Maybe some things worth the hurt. Eleanor closed the distance between them then, her hands reaching for his before she could stop herself. His hands were rough with calluses, marked by labor and violence, and a lifetime of being used as a tool. Hers were soft, pampered, decorated with rings that cost more than a human life in the economy that had created them both. When their fingers intertwined, it felt like revolution and damnation all at once. They stood like that for minutes that felt like hours, not speaking, barely breathing, just holding on to each other across a divide that was supposed to be absolute. Eleanor could feel his pulse through his palm, could feel the tremor in his hands that matched the trembling in her own. "This is madness," she whispered. "Yes. They'll kill you if they find out. Yes, I can't protect you. I have no power. You ain't just anything," Elijah interrupted, and his voice carried a fierceness that made her look up into his eyes. "You a person who see me as a person. In this whole damn world, that more rare than gold, that more precious than freedom itself sometimes. To be seen, really seen. You know how long it's been since I felt that? Then see me too," Eleanor said. "Please, see me. Not the governor's wife, not the proper lady, not the thing I have to be for everyone else. Just me. The person I was before they told me who I had to become." "I see you, Eleanor," he said, and hearing her name from his lips, just her name without title or distance, felt like being baptized into something new and terrifying. "I've been seeing you since that first day in the stables, seeing the loneliness you carry like I carry mine, seeing the cage you in, even though yours got silk bars instead of iron. Seeing the way you hungry for something real, something that ain't performance or duty or living for other people's expectations." "What are we doing?" Eleanor asked, and she was not sure if she meant in this moment or in the larger arc of what they had set in motion. "I don't know," Elijah admitted, "but I know I'm tired of surviving without living, tired of being dead inside just to stay alive outside. If this the only time I get to feel human, to feel wanted, to feel like I matter to somebody, even if it only lasts a minute, even if it costs me everything, maybe that worth it." They were still holding hands when they heard footsteps approaching the workshed. They broke apart instantly, muscle memory and terror moving faster than thought. Elijah grabbed his tools. Eleanor smoothed her dress, and by the time Thaddeus Cole appeared in the doorway, they were 6 feet apart. A perfectly proper distance between mistress and slave, nothing to see but a woman who had wandered into the wrong building, and a man focused entirely on his work. But Cole was not a fool. His eyes moved between them with the calculating assessment of a man who made his living reading guilt and fear. He was 43, lean and weathered, with a face that seemed to have been carved from something harder than flesh. He carried a whip coiled at his belt, more as symbol than tool. Everyone knew what he was capable of, and most days the threat was enough. "Afternoon, Mrs. Beaumont," he said, his voice carrying a false politeness that somehow made his words more menacing. "Can I help you find something?" "I was looking for the stable master," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the thundering of her heart. "My mare has been favoring her left foreleg." "Stable master in the south barn, ma'am. This here's just the workshed. Nothing of interest to a lady." "Of course, my apologies." Eleanor moved toward the door, forcing herself to walk slowly to maintain the dignity expected of her station. As she passed Cole, she felt his eyes on her like a physical touch, assessing, calculating, storing information for future use. She did not look back at Elijah. But that night, lying in her bed while her husband snored in his separate chamber, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and felt the ghost of Elijah's hand in hers. She understood now what she had done, what they had done together. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had felt something that made them both vulnerable in ways that could get them both destroyed. And she knew, with the clarity that comes from standing on the edge of an abyss, that she could not stop, would not stop. That whatever this was, love or madness or the desperate rebellion of two caged souls, it had become more necessary than safety, more vital than survival. In the slave quarters, Elijah lay on his pallet and touched his palm where her hand had been, trying to memorize the feeling before the world took it away. He knew what was coming. He had always known. Men like him did not get happy endings. They got nooses and fire and their names used as warnings. But for a moment in that workshed, he had been fully alive. He had been seen. He had mattered, and if that was all he ever got, he thought, maybe that was enough to die for. Mama Seraphine, unable to sleep, sat by her window and watched the main house. She had seen this before, generations ago, when she was young. A white woman and a black man forgetting what the world demanded of them. It had ended in blood then. It would end in blood now. She began to pray, though she was not sure what she was praying for. Their salvation or their swift end, mercy or justice, forgiveness or the strength to survive what was coming. Because something was coming. She could feel it in the air, thick and heavy as the August heat that was rolling toward Louisiana like an army of fire. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would consume them all. August turned the Beaumont estate into a furnace. The heat was so oppressive that even the wealthy retreated into lethargy, moving slowly through their days, fanning themselves with expensive imports, while enslaved people worked fields that shimmered like mirages. The cotton was ready for harvest, which meant 18-hour days, under a sun that seemed determined to burn the world clean. Elijah worked until his hands bled, until his back screamed, until exhaustion became a kind of mercy that let him stop thinking about the impossibility of what he felt. But even exhaustion could not erase Eleanor from his mind. She was there in every moment, in the way the light fell through the trees, in the sound of wind through magnolias, in the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with physical labor. Eleanor, for her part, had become someone she barely recognized. The proper governor's wife, who had moved through life like a wind-up doll, had been replaced by a woman who lived only for stolen moments, for the brief encounters in the garden before dawn, for the seconds when she could see Elijah from a window and know he was alive, was real, was still in the world. They could not speak anymore, not after Cole's interruption in the workshed. The overseer had begun watching them both with the focused attention of a hunter who had spotted prey. He appeared wherever Eleanor walked, his presence a constant reminder of surveillance and threat. He assigned Elijah to the farthest fields, the hardest labor, the positions where he would be most visible and most controlled. It was a kind of torture to be so close and yet impossibly separate, to see each other across distances that might as well have been oceans. Eleanor felt it like a physical pain, a constant ache in her chest that no amount of laudanum or prayer could ease. So she did something reckless. She began to write letters. They started as a way to ease the pressure building inside her, thoughts and feelings she had no one else to share with, confessions she could not speak aloud. She wrote late at night in her private sitting room, by candlelight, her hand moving across paper in loops and curves that felt like prayers or spells or the mapping of forbidden territory. She wrote about her childhood, about the girl she had been before her father sold her future for political advancement. She wrote about her marriage, about the slow death of living without intimacy or understanding. She wrote about meeting Elijah, about the way something dormant inside her had awakened, about the terror and exhilaration of feeling fully alive for the first time. She did not intend to send them, at first. But after 2 weeks of silence, of seeing him only from afar, of the crushing loneliness that came from having touched something real and then having it torn away. She could not bear it anymore. She found a way. There was a girl named Dinah, 16 years old, who worked in the main house as a chambermaid. She was small and quiet, clever in the way that enslaved people had to be clever to survive, attentive without seeming to pay attention, present without being noticed, smart enough to understand the dangers of white people's secrets. Eleanor approached her one evening when the rest of the household was at dinner. "Dinah," she said quietly, "I need your help with something." The girl's eyes went wide with fear. White people asking for help usually meant danger, either for the person being asked or for someone they loved. "Yes, ma'am," Dinah said carefully. Eleanor handed her a folded piece of paper, sealed with wax. "I need you to give this to Elijah, the man who works in the fields. Do you know who I mean?" Dinah's expression shifted to something close to terror. "Ma'am, Please." Eleanor's voice cracked with desperation. "I know what I'm asking. I know the danger, but I have no one else. And She stopped, trying to find words that would convey urgency without revealing too much. "I need him to know something important. Mrs. Beaumont, if they catch me, they won't. You're invisible to them. They never really see any of you." The words came out before Eleanor could stop them, and she heard the ugliness of the truth in them. "I'm sorry. That wasn't... I just mean you can move through spaces I can't. You can reach him when I can't. Please, Dinah, please." The girl looked at the letter like it was a snake, something that could bite and poison and kill. But she also saw something in Eleanor's face that maybe reminded her that white women could hurt too, even if their hurting looked different, meant different things, came with different consequences. "If I do this," Dinah said slowly, "you got to promise me something. Anything. When this blow up, and it will, ma'am, it always do, you remember that I was just following orders, that I didn't have no choice, that I was scared, and you was the master's wife, and I couldn't say no." The words were a gut punch of reality. Eleanor understood what Dinah was really saying. "When this ends badly, I need you to protect me. I need you to lie for me. I need you to remember that I have no power here, that I'm as trapped as you, but with far less protection." "I promise," Eleanor said. "I'll protect you, no matter what happens." Dinah took the letter and tucked it into her apron, already planning how to reach Elijah without being seen, calculating the risks like a general planning a military campaign, because that was what survival looked like for people who had no rights, no protection, no margin for error. That night, during the brief window between dinner service and bed, when the enslaved workers of the main house had a few minutes that almost resembled their own, Dinah slipped out to the quarters where the field workers slept. She found Elijah sitting outside his cabin, too hot asleep inside, staring at nothing, with the exhausted 1,000-yard gaze of someone who had spent the day being worked like machinery. "Got something for you," Dinah whispered, pressing the letter into his hand. "From the big house, She didn't say Eleanor's name. Names had power. Names could be testimony. Elijah looked at the sealed paper in his hand like it was both treasure and bomb. "Who else know about this?" "Just me, and I'm trying real hard to forget I know." "Smart girl." "No such thing as a smart slave," Dinah replied with bitter wisdom beyond her years. "Just lucky ones and dead ones. Try to stay lucky." She disappeared back toward the main house, leaving Elijah alone with the letter and the knowledge that opening it would change everything. He waited until everyone else was asleep. Then, by the light of a carefully shielded candle, he broke the wax seal and read Eleanor's handwriting for the first time. "Elijah, I do not know if this will reach you. I do not know if you will want to read it if it does. But I have to try, because the silence is unbearable, and I need you to know things I cannot say aloud. I was dead before I met you. I know that sounds melodramatic, but it's true. I moved through my life like a ghost, performing a role, saying lines someone else had written, existing entirely for other people's benefit. I had forgotten what it felt like to want something, to need something, to feel anything beyond obligation and fear. And then I saw you, and something woke up inside me that I didn't even know had been sleeping. I know this is impossible. I know what the world says about people like us reaching for each other. I know the danger. God, I know the danger. Every moment I think about you is a moment I risk your life, and that knowledge is a weight I carry like stones in my pockets. But I cannot stop. I have tried. I have prayed for strength and discipline, and the wisdom to let go of this madness. But all I feel is more desperate, more hollow, more aware that if I cannot see you, cannot speak to you, cannot know that you exist and think of me sometimes, then I am back to being dead, and I cannot bear it. You said in the workshed that some things are worth the hurt. I think about those words constantly. I think about what it means to choose pain over numbness, danger over safety, feeling over survival. And I realize that maybe that's what being alive actually means. Not just existing, not just enduring, but choosing to feel even when feeling might destroy you. I don't know what I'm asking from you. I don't have the right to ask anything. You owe me nothing. I'm part of the system that has stolen everything from you, and no amount of feeling or wanting can change that fundamental injustice. But if there is any part of you that feels what I feel, that sees what I see when I look at you, if there is any possibility of something real between us, even if it can only exist in letters and shadows and stolen moments, please write back. Please let me know I'm not alone in this madness. Please let me know I matter to you the way you matter to me. Yours in ways I have no right to be. Eleanor Elijah read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking, his throat tight with emotions he had no safe way to express. She had put into words everything he felt, but could never say, had articulated the impossible thing growing between them with a clarity that was both beautiful and terrifying. Writing back was insane. It created evidence. It made the invisible visible. It gave their enemies exactly what they would need to destroy them both. He should burn the letter, should forget it, should protect himself the way he had learned to protect himself from the moment he understood that he was considered property rather than person. But he didn't burn it. Instead, he found a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper, and in handwriting that was careful and cramped from years of secretly teaching himself to read and write, skills that were illegal for him to possess, that could get him whipped or sold or worse, he wrote back. Eleanor, you talk about being dead before you met me. I understand that more than you know. I've been dead inside since I was 8 years old and first understood that my life wasn't never going to be mine. Dead since they sold my wife. Dead since I held my daughter for the last time and knew I couldn't save her. Dead in all the ways that matter except my body still working, still moving, still doing what it told to do. Then you walked into that stable and looked at me like I was a man instead of a thing, and something I thought was gone forever started breathing again. I'm scared, Eleanor, more scared than I ever been, and I've been scared plenty, because hope is dangerous for people like me. Wanting things is dangerous. Feeling things is dangerous. They teach us from children that the only way to survive is to kill everything inside that makes us human, to become machines that work and obey and never complain. But you making me remember I got a heart. And hearts can break, and breaking gonna hurt worse than anything Cole's whip ever done to me. I think about you all the time. In the fields when the sun's so hot I can barely see straight. In the night when I can't sleep, in the moments between moments when I let myself forget what I am and just feel what I feel. And what I feel is something I got no words for, something I got no right to feel, something that might kill us both. But yeah, you matter to me. More than anything has mattered in longer than I can remember, and if that makes me a fool, if that seals my fate, if that brings down everything, at least I got to feel it. At least I got to be alive, really alive for a little while. Write to me again, please, even if it dangerous, even if it wrong, even if we both know how this probably gonna end. Let me be alive a little longer. Elijah. The letters continued through August and into September. Dinah became their unlikely courier, moving between the worlds of house and field, with messages hidden in her apron, her sleeves, once even in the lining of a basket of laundry. She did it partly because she had no real choice, partly because she was paid in small favors Eleanor could grant, but mostly because she understood something that white people rarely did. Enslaved people had their own lives, their own loves, their own desperate reaches for happiness in a world designed to deny them anything resembling joy. She had seen Elijah and Eleanor together only once, that day in the workshed. But she had seen the way they looked at each other, and it reminded her of the way her own parents had looked before they were sold to different owners, before love became just another thing that white people could take away on a whim. So she carried the letters, even though it terrified her, even though she knew it could get her killed or sold, or beaten so badly she'd never recover. She carried them because sometimes you had to do something dangerous just to remember you were human. The letters grew longer, more intimate, more honest. Eleanor wrote about her childhood, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about the suffocating expectations of Southern womanhood. Elijah wrote about his life before slavery, the fragments of memory from a childhood that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. They wrote about books Eleanor had read, and Elijah wished he could read openly. They wrote about dreams they had, futures they could never inhabit, worlds where they might simply be two people who cared for each other without law or custom or violence standing between them. They wrote about love, though they never used that word. It was too dangerous, too absolute, too much like a confession that could be used against them in the court of public opinion that would inevitably try them both. But it was there in every line, in every carefully chosen word, in every letter that said, "I see you, I know you, I value you, you matter." And then, in late September, everything changed. Governor Charles Beaumont found the letters. He had not been looking for them specifically. He had been searching Eleanor's private chambers for something else. Her jewelry box, specifically, because he needed to borrow a valuable necklace as a gift for a political ally's wife. Eleanor was out calling on neighbors, and he had taken the opportunity to enter her rooms, something he rarely did. They maintained separate lives, separate spaces, a marriage of convenience and appearance rather than intimacy. But when he opened the drawer of her writing desk to search for the jewelry box key, he found instead a folded piece of paper. Curious. Eleanor was usually meticulously organized, and random papers were unlike her. He opened it. And read the first letter Elijah had written back to his wife. For a long moment, Charles Beaumont stood absolutely still, the letter in his hand, his face showing nothing. He had built a political career on controlling his expressions, on never revealing what he was thinking or feeling until it served his purposes to do so. But inside, behind the carefully maintained mask, something cold and terrible began to unfold. He read the letter again. Then he systematically searched Eleanor's desk until he found the others, 8 in total, hidden in various drawers and compartments. A secret correspondence that had been happening under his roof, between his wife and his property, for months. He read them all, every word, every confession, every expression of feeling that should not exist, could not be tolerated, represented a violation so fundamental it shook the very foundations of the order he had spent his life upholding. When he finished reading, Charles Beaumont very carefully folded the letters, placed them in his coat pocket, and left his wife's chambers. He walked downstairs, through the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, out onto the veranda where he could see the fields stretching into the distance. He stood there for a long time, smoking a cigar, thinking. Some men would have acted immediately in rage, but Charles Beaumont was not most men. He was a politician, a strategist, someone who understood that revenge served cold was revenge served effectively. He would not rush. He would not be impulsive. He would plan this carefully, would orchestrate it perfectly, would ensure that when he moved against them both, the consequences would be total and irreversible. Because this was not just about a wife's infidelity or a slave's presumption. This was about order, about power, about the fundamental principle that some people owned other people, that some lives mattered and others didn't, that the world had a hierarchy that had to be maintained at all costs. And Eleanor and Elijah had dared to suggest, through their feelings for each other, that perhaps that hierarchy was a lie, that perhaps all people were equally human, equally worthy, equally capable of love and dignity and mattering. That was the real transgression. Not sex. There had been plenty of that across racial lines in the South, all of it violent and one-directional and perfectly acceptable as long as white men did it to black women. But this mutual affection, this recognition of each other's humanity, this suggestion that a slave could be someone worthy of a white woman's love, this threatened the entire structure of Southern society. And Charles Beaumont would burn the world down before he let that stand. He finished his cigar, crushed it carefully under his boot, and went inside to plan. Eleanor knew something was wrong the moment she returned home that evening. There was a quality to the silence that felt different, charged, dangerous, like the air before a lightning strike. The servants moved through the house with unusual quickness, their eyes averted, their faces carefully blank in the way that meant they knew something terrible, but could not speak of it. Dinah found her in the upstairs hallway, her young face tight with fear. "Ma'am," she whispered urgently, "the governor been in your chambers. She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Eleanor understood immediately. The letters. Her blood turned to ice. She had been so careful, had hidden them so thoroughly, or so she thought. But clearly not carefully enough, not thoroughly enough, not nearly enough to protect what needed protecting. "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "His study. Been there for hours. Won't let nobody in." Eleanor went to her chambers first, moving quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The drawer where she had kept the letters was open, empty. She checked the other hiding places, though she already knew what she would find. Nothing. All of them gone. For a moment, she could not breathe. The room seemed to tilt around her, reality fragmenting into something surreal and nightmarish. This was the end. She knew it with absolute certainty. The letters were evidence that could not be denied, words in her own handwriting that documented everything. But her first thought was not for herself. Elijah, she had to warn him, had to somehow get word to him before Charles acted, because she understood her husband well enough to know that his rage would not be directed at her, not primarily. White women could be forgiven, could be explained away, could be cast as victims of seduction or madness or feminine weakness, but a black man who had dared to reach above his station, who had dared to feel affection for a white woman, who had dared to write words that suggested he saw himself as human and equal. There was no forgiveness for that. Only death. She found Dinah again. "You have to warn him," Eleanor said urgently, gripping the girl's thin shoulders. "You have to tell Elijah to run. Tonight. Now. Before—" "Too late, Mom," Dinah said, tears streaming down her face. "Cole and 3 other men already went to get him. The governor sent them an hour ago." Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. "No. No, God. No!" She ran, down the stairs, through the house, out into the humid September evening, her dress tangling around her legs, her carefully arranged hair coming loose, propriety abandoned entirely. She ran toward the slave quarters, toward the place where they would have taken Elijah, toward whatever horror was about to unfold. She could see them before she reached the quarters. A cluster of men near the overseer's house, torchlight cutting through the gathering darkness, the shapes of violence rendered in shadow and flame. Cole stood in the center, and next to him, his hands tied behind his back, his face already bloodied, was Elijah. "Stop!" Eleanor screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Stop this now!" The men turned to look at her, their faces registering surprise and something like embarrassment. A white woman running through the slave quarters, her hair wild, her dress torn from her sprint through the grounds. It was unseemly, shocking, a violation of every code of conduct that governed Southern femininity. Cole's expression shifted to something cruel and satisfied. "Mrs. Beaumont, you should return to the house. This ain't business for a lady to witness." "I said stop!" Eleanor reached the circle of men, her chest heaving, her eyes finding Elijah's face. He looked at her with an expression that broke her heart, not surprise, not anger, but a kind of sad inevitability, as if he had always known it would end this way and was almost relieved to have it done with. "Eleanor, go back," he said quietly. "Don't make this worse." "Worse?" She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "How could this possibly be worse?" "That's enough." Charles Beaumont's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He had appeared from the direction of the main house, walking slowly, deliberately, his face a mask of cold fury. "Eleanor, return to the house. Immediately." "No." The word hung in the air like an explosion. Wives did not refuse their husbands in this world, this time, this place. Women did not defy men, especially not in public, especially not in front of enslaved people who might get ideas about resistance being possible. Charles moved closer, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "You will return to the house, or I will have you carried there. Do not test me on this." "Then have me carried," Eleanor said, and she was shaking, but her voice was steady. "Because I am not leaving him." For a moment, something flickered across Charles's face. Shock, perhaps, or recognition that his wife had become someone he did not know, someone capable of defiance he had never imagined possible. "Do you understand what you've done?" Charles asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Do you comprehend the scandal, the humiliation, the absolute destruction of everything I've built? I understand that I've fallen in love with a man who is more decent and honest than you will ever be," Eleanor said, and once the words were out, she felt a strange lightness, as if confession was its own kind of freedom. "I understand that I have spent 15 years of my life being your decoration, your proof of civilization, your pretty possession. And I understand that for the first time, I have felt like an actual human being instead of an ornament on your shelf." Charles's hand moved so fast, she barely saw it coming. The slap knocked her sideways, stars exploding across her vision, the taste of blood, sudden and bright in her mouth. She heard Elijah make a sound of rage and saw him lunge forward before 3 men grabbed him, holding him back, their hands brutal and efficient. "Don't you touch her!" Elijah shouted, fighting against the men who held him, and for a moment the mask of careful submission fell away entirely, revealing the man underneath, the one who had been forced to hide his intelligence, his strength, his capacity for love and rage and everything human that slavery tried to strip away. "You see?" Charles said to the assembled men, his voice carrying a terrible satisfaction. "You see the presumption, the absolute audacity. This animal thinks he has the right to defend a white woman, thinks he has the right to feel anything but gratitude for his station. This is what happens when they are allowed to forget their place." "He has done nothing wrong," Eleanor said, pushing herself upright, ignoring the pain radiating through her skull. "We wrote letters. We spoke. She stopped, understanding suddenly that any explanation she gave would only make things worse. There was no defense that would save Elijah, no argument that would penetrate the fortress of rage and wounded pride her husband had erected. "You wrote letters," Charles repeated, pulling the folded papers from his pocket. "Yes, I've read them, every word. Love letters, between my wife and my property, between a woman of the highest social standing and a field slave who cannot even legally be taught to read and write." He turned to Elijah, his face cold. "Though apparently you taught yourself, didn't you? Another crime, another presumption, Another example of why strict discipline is necessary. "If you hurt him," Eleanor said, her voice trembling, "I will never forgive you. I will leave you. I will make sure every person of consequence from here to New Orleans knows exactly what kind of man you are." Charles laughed, and the sound was genuinely amused. "Leave me? With what resources? What money? What protection? You are my wife, Eleanor. Legally, you are my property, almost as much as he is. You can threaten all you like, but we both know you have no power here. You have never had power. You have only had my permission to pretend you did." The truth of it struck her like another blow. He was right. In the eyes of the law, in the structure of society, she had no independent existence. She was Mrs. Charles Beaumont, extension of her husband, possession of her father before him. She could not own property, could not enter contracts, could not even leave her marriage without her husband's permission. She had no legal standing, no financial resources, no power beyond what men chose to grant her. She had always known this, abstractly, but facing it now, seeing how completely trapped she was, understanding that all her privilege meant nothing when it came to actual autonomy, it was devastating. "So here is what will happen," Charles continued, his voice taking on the quality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You, Eleanor, will be sent to your sister's house in Charleston. You will remain there for 6 months while we allow the scandal to die down. We will tell people you have had a nervous collapse, that you require rest and medical attention. People will gossip, but they will believe it, because what else could explain such madness? When you return, you will be a model wife. Obedient, silent, properly grateful for my mercy in not divorcing you and destroying what little reputation you have left." He turned to Elijah. "As for you, you have committed multiple crimes, teaching yourself to read and write, corresponding with your master's wife, attempting to be what you can never be. The punishment for such presumption is usually death, but I have something more fitting in mind." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Death would have been terrible, but at least it would have been quick. The way Charles said "more fitting" suggested something far worse. "I am selling you," Charles said, watching Elijah's face for reaction. "Tomorrow morning, to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, the Hendricks operation. I believe you've heard of it?" Even in the torchlight, Eleanor could see Elijah's face go pale. Everyone had heard of the Hendricks plantation. It was a death sentence disguised as a sale. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person there was 3 years. The work was so brutal, the conditions so horrific, that it was considered punishment worse than execution. "You cannot," Eleanor whispered. "Charles, please, I am begging you. I can, and I will. He will be worked to death in that hellhole, but slowly, painfully, with years to contemplate his presumption and the consequences of forgetting his place. And you, my dear wife, will spend the rest of your life knowing that your selfishness, your inability to control your base emotions, led directly to his destruction." "No!" Eleanor lunged toward Charles, but Cole grabbed her, his hands rough on her arms. "You are a monster! A complete monster! He is innocent! We have done nothing but write letters, but feel things we cannot help feeling." "Innocence and guilt are not measured by your feelings," Charles said coldly. "They are measured by the order of things, by the laws of God and man that separate the civilized from the savage, the master from the slave. You have violated that order, you both have, and order must be restored, no matter the cost." He gestured to Cole. "Take him to the holding cell. Make sure he's ready for transport at dawn. As for Mrs. Beaumont," he looked at Eleanor with something that might have been pity if it had been mixed with any warmth at all. "Take her to her chambers and lock the door. Post guards. She is to speak to no one until her carriage departs for Charleston tomorrow afternoon." "I hate you," Eleanor said, the words flat and absolute. "For the rest of my life, no matter how many years I have left, I will hate you with every breath I take." "I can live with that," Charles replied, "as long as you do so quietly and without further scandal." They dragged Elijah away, and he did not fight. What would have been the point? Fighting would only have given them an excuse to beat him worse, to add more punishment to the hell he was already sentenced to endure. As they pulled him past Eleanor, their eyes met for one last moment. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, tears streaming down her face. He shook his head slightly, as if to say there was nothing to apologize for, as if he would do it all again, as if the brief time of being seen and valued was worth any price they would make him pay. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and Eleanor was being dragged back toward the mansion, her sobs echoing through the humid night air. In her chambers, locked in and guarded, Eleanor collapsed to the floor and wept until she had no tears left. She had destroyed him. Her feelings, her selfishness, her inability to accept the prison of her life. She had sentenced him to death. Not quick death, but the slow, grinding horror of working himself to nothing in the Mississippi heat. She had loved him, and love had become destruction. Around midnight she heard sounds outside, movement, shouting, the chaos of something happening. She ran to her window and saw flames. The slave quarters were on fire, not the main buildings, but smaller structures, storage sheds, the holding cell, where they would have been keeping Elijah. Flames climbed into the night sky, turning everything orange and red and terrible. Eleanor watched, her hands pressed against the glass, and understood that someone had decided freedom through fire was better than slow death in Mississippi. Whether it was Elijah himself or other enslaved people who had decided to help him, she would never know. But she prayed with an intensity that surprised her, given how little she had believed in God for years, that he had made it out, that he was running through the darkness toward something better, that maybe, somehow, he would survive. The fire was contained within an hour. The main house was never in danger. But in the chaos and smoke and confusion, one thing became clear. Elijah was gone. They found the holding cell empty, the lock broken from the outside, no trace of him anywhere on the grounds. Dogs were sent out to track him, but the rain that began to fall just after midnight washed away his scent. Patrols were organized, rewards posted, notices sent to neighboring plantations and towns. But Elijah had vanished into the night like smoke, like a ghost, like something that had never existed at all. Charles was furious, but there was nothing to be done. An escaped slave was a financial loss, but not an unprecedented one. It happened. The punishment would be terrible if Elijah was caught, but Charles had larger concerns now, managing the scandal, protecting his political career, ensuring that his wife's disgrace did not destroy everything he had built. Eleanor was sent to Charleston the next day as planned. She went quietly, numbly, feeling like all the life had been drained out of her. The letters were destroyed, the evidence eliminated, the story reshaped into something more palatable. A wife who had suffered a nervous breakdown, a slave who had taken advantage and then fled when discovered, a husband showing mercy and discretion by handling the matter privately. Society accepted the explanation because it wanted to. Because the alternative, that a white woman and a black man had genuinely cared for each other, had seen each other as equals, had dared to love across the chasm of race and power, was too threatening to acknowledge. But Eleanor knew the truth. And in Charleston, sitting in her sister's drawing room, surrounded by people who treated her with pity and condescension, she made a decision. She would survive this, would get through the 6 months of exile, would return to Louisiana and play the role expected of her, but she would never, ever forgive. And she would never stop looking for signs that Elijah had survived, that he had made it north, that somewhere in this vast country he was alive and free and remembered her. It was a small hope, but it was all she had. And in the Mississippi swamps, moving by night, following the North Star, drinking from streams and eating what he could steal or catch, Elijah kept moving. His body was weak from the beating Cole had given him before the fire. His hands were raw from breaking the lock on the holding cell. a lock weakened by someone he never learned who had decided to help him even at great risk to themselves. But he was alive, and he was free, and every night before he slept in whatever hiding place he had found, he thought of Eleanor, of her face, her voice, her letters, the brief, impossible thing they had shared. Some loves, he thought, are worth dying for, but this one, maybe, was worth living for. So he kept moving north, toward a freedom he had never known, carrying her memory like a light in the darkness. 6 months became a year, then 2. Eleanor returned from Charleston in the spring of 1848, thinner than when she left, quieter, her beauty dimmed by something that looked like grief, but moved like rage. She played her role with mechanical precision, the penitent wife, the recovered invalid, the woman who had learned her lesson and now understood her place. Charles accepted her back because divorce would have been more scandalous than reconciliation. They resumed their separate lives under the same roof, barely speaking, meeting only when social obligation demanded the performance of marriage. At night, Eleanor lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. There was no word of Elijah. He had not been caught, which meant either he had made it north or he had died somewhere along the way, and his body had never been found. Eleanor preferred to believe the former. She had to believe it, because the alternative was unbearable. The Beaumont estate continued as it always had. Cotton was planted and harvested. Enslaved people worked and suffered and died and were replaced. Charles's political career advanced. The world turned according to its cruel logic. And nothing changed except that Eleanor now understood exactly how much she despised that world and everything it represented. She began doing small things, acts of quiet rebellion that no one would notice or care about. She taught several of the house servants to read in secret, hiding books in her chambers, conducting lessons behind locked doors. She arranged for extra food to be sent to the quarters, for medicine when people fell ill, for small kindnesses that could not undo the massive injustice but might ease individual suffering. Dinah became her ally in these efforts. The girl who had carried the letters had grown into a woman of 20, sharper and more cautious than ever, but still willing to risk herself for tiny moments of defiance against the system that owned her. "You think he made it north?" Dinah asked one day in late 1849, while they were sorting through Eleanor's wardrobe, ostensibly organizing, but really just finding private time to talk. "I have to believe he did," Eleanor said. "I have to believe all of it meant something." "Maybe it did," Dinah replied quietly. "Maybe just the trying was the something. Maybe just feeling human for a minute was worth it, even if it ended bad." Eleanor looked at the young woman, still so young, still trapped, still finding ways to survive with dignity and intelligence and a fierce refusal to be broken. "You're wise beyond your years, Dinah." "Ain't about wisdom, ma'am. It's about what you gotta tell yourself to make it through the day." The years continued to pass. 1850, 1851. The country was tearing itself apart over slavery, though people pretended otherwise. The Compromise of 1850 papered over the divisions without resolving them. Tension crackled through the South as more enslaved people ran north, as white abolitionists grew louder, as the economic system built on human bondage began to show its fractures. Charles became increasingly paranoid about slave rebellions, about the influence of northern ideas, about maintaining control through ever harsher discipline. The overseer, Cole, was given free rein to terrorize the workforce. Punishments became more brutal. The quarters became a place of constant fear. Eleanor watched it all with horror and helplessness. She had no power to change anything. Her small acts of kindness were drops in an ocean of cruelty. She was complicit by her very existence in this house, on this plantation, in this system that ground human beings into nothing for profit. The guilt ate at her, but so did the anger. And underneath both, a question kept surfacing. What would Elijah want her to do? If he was alive, if he had made it to freedom, if he thought of her at all, what would he want her legacy to be? In the winter of 1852, Eleanor made a decision. She began documenting everything, writing down the names of enslaved people on the plantation, their stories, their families, the injustices they suffered. She recorded Cole's atrocities in careful detail. She noted Charles's business dealings, his political corruption, the ways he maintained power through violence and fear. She did not know what she would do with this information, but she gathered it, organized it, hid it carefully in places no one would think to look. It was dangerous work. If Charles discovered it, if anyone discovered it, she would be punished, possibly institutionalized, certainly removed from the estate and any ability to help anyone. But she did it anyway, because it was the only form of resistance available to her, the only way to honor what she and Elijah had shared, the only path toward making her life mean something beyond decorative suffering. Mama Seraphine noticed the change in Eleanor. The old woman was in her 60s now, her body bent by decades of labor, but her eyes still sharp, still seeing everything. "You walking a dangerous road, Miss Eleanor," she said one day, catching Eleanor alone in the kitchen garden. "I know. You think you're going to save people with your writing? You think words on paper going to change what this is?" "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to say, this happened, these people existed. These crimes were committed. Even if no one ever reads it, even if it changes nothing, someone needs to write it down." Seraphine studied her for a long moment, then she nodded. "My grandbaby, the one they sold off last year. Her name was Ruth. She was 12 years old. She could sing like an angel. I want you to write that down. I want you to make sure somebody remembers she existed, that she had a name, that she mattered." "I will," Eleanor promised. "I'll write about Ruth and about everyone else. I'll make sure they're remembered." It became a kind of mission. Enslaved people began coming to Eleanor with their stories, trusting her with their histories, their losses, the names of children stolen, spouses sold, parents killed. She wrote it all down, created a record of testimony that was both memorial and indictment. She knew it was dangerous for them as much as for her. Association with her could bring suspicion, could mark them as potential rebels or troublemakers. But they came anyway, driven by the human need to be remembered, to have their existence acknowledged, to matter to someone. Then, in the spring of 1853, something happened that changed everything. A letter arrived. Not through normal channels, not addressed to Eleanor officially, but slipped to Dinah by a traveling peddler who came through selling goods to the plantation. The peddler was a free black man from Pennsylvania, part of a network that moved information and occasionally people along secret routes. Dinah brought the letter to Eleanor, her hands shaking. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The handwriting was different, more confident, more practiced than it had been 5 years ago, but she knew it immediately. "Eleanor, I'm alive. I made it north. It took 2 years of hiding and running and nearly dying more times than I can count. But I'm in Canada now. I'm free. I shouldn't write to you. I know the danger, but I had to let you know I survived. That what we had wasn't just destroyed, that something good came from all that pain. I learned to read better here. Learned to write proper. Got a job working as a carpenter. Got a small room that belongs to me, that nobody can take away. I wake up every morning and remember I'm not property anymore, and sometimes I can't believe it's real. But it is real. I'm real. I'm alive. And I think about you every day. I know you probably married still. I know you probably can't leave, can't risk everything for something impossible. I'm not asking you to. I just wanted you to know that the choice we made, the risk we took, it wasn't for nothing. You gave me something to live for when I had forgotten how to want to live. You made me remember I was human, and now I'm free. And being free, being whole, being able to choose my own path, that's partly because of you. because you saw me when nobody else did, because you made me believe I was worth something. I don't know if you'll ever get this letter. I don't know if trying to reach you will just bring more trouble, but I had to try. Thank you, Eleanor, for seeing me, for valuing me, for loving me when the world said it was impossible. Thank you for everything. Yours always, Elijah. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with emotion she could barely name. Relief, joy, grief for all the lost time, rage at a world that had forced them apart, and something else. Something that felt like purpose, crystallizing into action. She found Dinah. I need you to help me do something insane. Ma'am, I need to leave. I need to go north. I need to... Eleanor stopped, suddenly aware of how it sounded. A white woman abandoning her life, her marriage, her entire world, to chase a man she had not seen in 5 years, a relationship that had existed mostly in letters and stolen moments. But Dinah did not look shocked. She looked resigned, almost relieved. I've been wondering when you was going to decide this, the young woman said. Been watching you get thinner and sadder and more angry every year. Figured eventually you'd have to choose between dying here or living somewhere else. I can't just leave, Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she was trying to figure out how she could do exactly that. I have no money of my own, no way to travel, no... You got jewelry, Dinah interrupted. You got things you could sell, and you got me. And I got connections to people who help folks run north. Not just slaves, Mom. Sometimes white women trying to escape bad marriages. People in trouble. People who need to disappear. Eleanor stared at her. You're part of the Underground Railroad. Not officially, but I know people who know people. And if you serious about this, if you really ready to give up everything you got here, even though it ain't much, then I can get you connected. What about you? Eleanor asked. If I leave, if Charles discovers you help me, he'll kill me. Yeah, probably. Dinah's voice was matter-of-fact. But I'm 24 years old, and I'm tired, Miss Eleanor. I'm tired of being scared. Tired of watching people I love get sold or beaten or worked to death. Tired of surviving instead of living. So maybe this my chance too. Maybe I run north same time you do. Maybe we both get free. Eleanor felt something like hope stirring in her chest for the first time in years. You would do that? Risk everything? Already been risking everything just by being born black in Louisiana, Dinah replied. At least this way, I'm risking it for something that might actually change my life instead of just trying to make it through another day. They began planning in secret. It would take months to prepare, to gather resources, to make connections with the network that could help them travel north, to create a cover story that would buy them time before Charles realized Eleanor was gone. Eleanor sold jewelry piece by piece, claiming she was having items repaired or reset. She gathered clothes that could be worn for travel rather than society. She continued her documentation project, preparing to take the records with her as evidence of the atrocities happening on plantations across the South. And she wrote back to Elijah, a letter that Dinah sent through the same network that had delivered his. Elijah, I'm coming. I don't know when, I don't know exactly how, but I'm coming north. I refuse to spend the rest of my life as a ghost in this house, married to a man I despise, complicit in a system that destroys everything beautiful and human. You gave me the courage to remember I have choices, even when the world says I don't. You showed me what it means to be brave, to risk everything for the possibility of being whole. Wait for me. However long it takes, wait for me. I love you. I have always loved you, and I'm done pretending I don't. Eleanor, the letter was sent in August 1853. Eleanor began finalizing her plans for escape. But in September, disaster struck. Charles discovered her documentation project. Not by accident. He had been having her watched, had become suspicious of her behavior, her secret meetings with Dinah, her odd questions about travel and routes north. He found the records hidden in her chambers. pages and pages of testimony, names, dates, descriptions of punishments and sales and atrocities. Evidence that could destroy his reputation, his political career, his entire life if it ever became public. His rage was ice-cold and methodical. He did not confront Eleanor immediately. Instead, he planned, just as he had planned 5 years earlier when he discovered the letters. But this time he would not be content with exile or separation. This time he would ensure that Eleanor could never threaten him again. That her stories, her testimony, her dangerous ideas about equality and justice would die with her. On the night of October 15, 1853, Charles Beaumont set his plan in motion, and the world erupted in flames. The fire started just after midnight in the east wing of the mansion, in a storage room filled with old furniture and draperies, materials that would burn hot and fast. By the time the house servants realized what was happening, the flames had already climbed the walls and begun racing through the corridors like a living thing hungry for destruction. Eleanor woke to smoke and shouting. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, she could not understand what was happening. Then she smelled it, acrid, choking, the unmistakable scent of fire consuming wood and fabric and everything in its path. She stumbled from her bed, reaching for a robe, her mind racing through calculations of escape routes and what she could grab before fleeing. But when she tried her chamber door, she found it locked from the outside. Terror flooded through her. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the noise of the fire drowned out her voice. Smoke was beginning to seep under the door, wisps of grey that promised suffocation before the flames ever reached her. Charles had locked her in. The understanding hit her like physical blow. This was not accident. This was murder, carefully orchestrated to look like tragedy. A terrible fire that claimed the governor's unstable wife, the poor woman who had never recovered from her nervous breakdown, who had become increasingly erratic and difficult. Such a shame, such a loss. But these things happen. Eleanor stopped pounding and forced herself to think. The door was solid, reinforced. She could not break through it. But there was a window. She ran to it, threw back the curtains, tried to open it and found it too had been fastened shut. Likely earlier that day when she had been out of her chambers. Every exit blocked, every escape route sealed. Charles had planned this perfectly. But Eleanor Beaumont had not survived the last 6 years by accepting defeat gracefully. She grabbed a heavy candlestick and began smashing the window. Glass shattered, falling in glittering shards to the ground 2 stories below. Not a survivable jump, but better than burning alive. She was halfway through clearing the remaining glass from the frame when she heard the door to her chamber crash open. She spun around, expecting Charles or perhaps Cole coming to ensure the job was finished. Instead, she saw Dinah, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wild with fear and determination. Behind her, Mama Seraphine and 2 other enslaved women from the house. "Come on!" Dinah shouted. "No time! How did you—" "Broke the lock. Now move, before this whole place come down." They ran through corridors, rapidly filling with smoke. Flames had consumed the east wing entirely and were advancing on the central sections of the house. The heat was overwhelming, oppressive, making it hard to breathe or see clearly. Eleanor could hear the groan of timber beginning to give way, the crack of beams failing under stress. They made it down the main staircase just as the chandelier fell, thousands of pieces of crystal exploding across the marble floor like a deadly rainstorm. Out through the front door, onto the lawn, joining the chaos of servants and enslaved people trying to fight the fire or rescue what possessions they could. But Eleanor did not see Charles anywhere. "Where's the governor?" she asked Dinah, shouting to be heard over the roar of flames. "Don't know. Ain't seen him since the fire started." Eleanor scanned the crowd of people, the organized chaos of water brigades and rescue attempts. No Charles, no Cole either, she realized. The 2 men who should have been directing the response were nowhere to be found, unless they had never intended to be found. "He's inside," Eleanor said with sudden certainty. Charles is still inside. He set the fire, but something went wrong. He got trapped. Good, Dinah said flatly. Let him burn. Eleanor looked at the young woman, saw the absolute absence of mercy in her face, and understood that Dinah had earned the right to that coldness. They all had. Every person who had suffered under Charles Beaumont's dominion, who had been worked and beaten and degraded and dehumanized, they had earned the right to watch him die and feel nothing but relief. But Eleanor found she could not. 15 years of marriage to a monster did not create love, but it did create something: history, familiarity, the complex tangle of feelings that comes from sharing a life, even when that life is poisonous. She despised Charles, hated him, wanted him to face justice for his crimes, but she could not stand here and watch him burn alive. I have to try to find him, she said. Miss Eleanor, you can't... But Eleanor was already running back toward the mansion, ignoring Dinah's shouts, ignoring the heat and smoke and danger. She pulled her robe up over her mouth and nose and plunged back into the burning building. The interior was hell-rendered visible. Flames climbed the walls like demons ascending. Smoke made visibility almost zero. The heat was so intense that Eleanor felt her skin beginning to blister just from proximity. She moved through rooms she had walked through thousands of times, now transformed into landscapes of nightmare. "Charles!" she screamed. "Charles! Where are you?" She found him in his study, the place where he had read her letters to Elijah 5 years ago, where he had planned his vengeance, where he had conducted the business of running a plantation built on human misery. He was on the floor, pinned under a fallen beam, his face grey with pain. When he saw Eleanor, something like surprise crossed his expression. "You," he said, his voice barely audible. "You came back." "I'm an idiot," Eleanor replied, moving toward him, assessing whether she could move the beam. It was massive, made of solid oak, impossible for one person to lift alone. "Why did you do this, Charles? Why try to kill me? I was going to leave anyway. You would have been rid of me." "Evidence," he gasped. "Your records, your documentation. If you took them north, if you shared them with abolitionists, everything I built would be destroyed. My career, my reputation, everything. So you decided to murder me instead. You forced my hand. You've been forcing my hand since the day you looked at that slave like he was human." Charles coughed, blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. "This is your fault, Eleanor. All of it. If you had just stayed in your place, been what a wife should be, then I would have been dead inside instead of literally dying in a fire," Eleanor interrupted. "And you know what, Charles? I prefer this. At least this way I got to be alive first. At least I got to feel real things, want real things, matter to someone." She grabbed the beam and tried to lift it. It did not move even a fraction of an inch. "Go," Charles said. "The house is coming down. You can't save me." "I know." Eleanor kept trying anyway, straining against the impossible weight. "But I have to try. Not for you, for me. So I can live with myself. So I don't become like you." "Idealistic and stupid," Charles said, but his voice had softened slightly. "That was always your problem." "No," Eleanor replied. "My problem was marrying you when I was 17 and didn't know better. Everything else, everything I did, everything I felt, everyone I loved, that was the solution, not the problem." She heard the house groaning, felt the floor beginning to tilt. They were out of time. The building was going to collapse, probably within minutes. "Eleanor," Charles said, his voice urgent now, frightened. "Go. Please. I don't..." He stopped, seemed to be deciding something. "I don't want you to die, not really. I was angry. I was..." Another cough, more blood. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, for what I did to him, for all of it." It was the first time in their 15 years of marriage that he had apologized for anything. And it was too little, too late, meaningless in the face of so much cruelty and destruction. But Eleanor still found herself saying, I know. Then Dinah and Seraphine were there, appearing through the smoke like angels or ghosts, grabbing Eleanor's arms and pulling her away from the beam, from Charles, from the study that was already being consumed by advancing flames. "No!" Eleanor fought against them. "We have to get him out." "He dead anyway," Seraphine said bluntly. "That beam crushed something inside. Even if we get him out, he gonna die. But you ain't gonna die with him. Not today." They dragged her through the burning house, Eleanor still fighting, still trying to go back, until they literally threw her out the front door and onto the lawn. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. By the time she could breathe again, the center of the house had collapsed inward, with a sound like the world ending. Charles Beaumont died in the ruins of the mansion he had built on the backs of enslaved people. His body would never be found, consumed entirely by flames that burned hot enough to turn bone to ash. Eleanor watched the house burn through the night, sitting on the grass with Dinah beside her, neither of them speaking. Around them, people moved in shock, trying to process what had happened, what they had lost or gained, what would come next. As dawn broke over the ruins, casting everything in shades of grey and gold, Eleanor realized that the records she had so carefully compiled were gone, burned, every name, every testimony, every piece of evidence, destroyed in the fire that was supposed to destroy her. But the people whose stories she had documented were still alive, still here, still capable of telling their own stories if anyone would listen. "What happens now?" Dinah asked quietly. Eleanor looked at the smoking remains of the Beaumont mansion, at the people gathered on the lawn, enslaved and free, black and white, all of them displaced by the night's chaos. "I don't know," she admitted. "Legally, the estate probably passes to Charles's brother. The plantation will continue. You'll all still be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Property," Dinah finished for her. "Yeah, nothing really changed, did it? Except now the big house gone and you a widow." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm still going north, as soon as I can arrange it, and I'm taking anyone who wants to come with me." Dinah turned to look at her. "You serious?" "Completely. Charles's brother will take weeks to arrive from Virginia. In that time, this place will be chaos. No clear authority, no organization, everyone trying to figure out what's next. That's our window. That's when we run. They'll come after us. Probably, but some of us might make it, and that's better than none of us trying." Eleanor met Dinah's eyes. "I can't undo what I was born into, can't change the system or fix the past, but I can refuse to participate anymore. I can use what resources I have, money, connections, the fact that I'm white and therefore invisible in ways you can't be, to help people escape. It's not enough. It's not even close to enough, but it's something." Dinah studied her face for a long time. Then she said, "Miss Eleanor, you finally growing a spine. Took you long enough." Eleanor laughed despite everything, a sound that was half sob, half genuine amusement. "Better late than never? We'll see about that." Over the next 3 weeks, Eleanor orchestrated the largest escape the parish of St. Helena had ever seen. Using what was left of her jewelry and the chaos of the estate's transition, she arranged transportation for 17 enslaved people along underground railroad routes north. Some would make it all the way to Canada. Others would find freedom in northern states. Some would be caught and returned and punished terribly, but they would all have tried. Would all have chosen risk over certainty, hope over despair, the possibility of freedom over the guarantee of bondage. Eleanor and Dinah left together on a cold November morning, just as Charles's brother arrived to take possession of what remained of the Beaumont fortune. They traveled through networks of safe houses and sympathetic conductors, sometimes hidden in wagons under false floors, sometimes walking through forests at night, always moving north toward the promise of something better. It took 4 months to reach Canada. Eleanor found Elijah in a small town outside Toronto, working as a carpenter, living in a modest room that was his own, his face fuller than she remembered, his eyes carrying less grief and more something that looked almost like peace. When she appeared at his door in March of 1854, 6.5 years after he had escaped the Beaumont plantation, he stared at her like she was a ghost. "Eleanor? I told you I was coming," she said. And then she was in his arms, both of them crying, holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who had crossed hell to reach this moment. They were married 3 weeks later, scandalized the small, free black community that had taken Elijah in, created a household that defied every convention of the world they had escaped. Dinah found work as a seamstress, eventually married a formerly enslaved man from Kentucky, and spent the rest of her life helping new escapees establish themselves in freedom. Eleanor never returned to the South. She lived in Canada with Elijah for 34 years, bore 3 children who grew up free and educated and never knew chains. She wrote about her experiences, published accounts under a pseudonym that detailed the realities of slavery from the perspective of someone who had benefited from it and then chosen to abandon that benefit. She died in 1888, at age 73, in a house she and Elijah had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried the legacy of 2 people who had refused to accept the world's definitions of who they could be and what they could mean to each other. Elijah outlived her by 4 years. He spent those years finishing a project they had started together, a memorial garden where they planted a magnolia tree for every person they knew who had died enslaved, every story Eleanor had documented and lost in the fire, every life that had mattered despite the world saying it didn't. The memorial still stands today, maintained by their descendants, a place of remembrance for those who resisted, who ran, who dared to be free, who loved across boundaries designed to keep them separate. And in Louisiana, the ruins of the Beaumont mansion became a legend, a cautionary tale about pride and transgression, about the dangers of violating the social order, about what happens when people forget their place. But for those who knew the real story, who understood what Eleanor and Elijah had shared, what they had sacrificed, what they had chosen despite impossible odds, the ruins meant something different. They were not a warning. They were a monument to the truth that love is more powerful than law, that humanity is more fundamental than hierarchy, that some things are worth burning the whole world down to protect. The Beaumont dynasty ended in fire and scandal, as Charles had always feared. But Eleanor and Elijah's story, their defiant, impossible, beautiful story that survived, and survival, in a world designed to destroy them both, was the greatest victory of all.